Hello, everyone. How are all of you today?
Good.
Good.
Awesome. Going to give everybody just a second to get logged in. You all know that you can change your view of everyone else's cameras, right? There's the speaker view, and then there's also the stacked view. So you might want to play around the gallery view, they call it, I think. So you might want to play around that if the speaker view, I think, makes it jump between cameras every time someone starts talking. And if that's like disorienting or weird, you can change it to gallery view, which is what I have it set on, so I can see all of your lovely faces. Okay, and yep, there's the chat. So feel free to use that. Okay, now I want to make sure I can figure out how to mute everybody. Oh, I'm in full screen, that's why. Okay, and so please do keep yourself muted unless you have, you know, something you want to say specifically, just so we don't get feedback issues. I think everybody is pretty much muted. Yep, awesome. Okay, I have a lot I want to do in this hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And let me know in the chat if you have a question or you want me to slow down or something. This is going to be recorded, so you can go back over it to take thorough notes. So if you want to just focus on listening and processing, you don't have to take notes. And during the webinar itself, you know, people process at different speeds and in different ways. So that is an option just in case you hadn't thought of that. So what I first want to do is I want to go over what I think the fundamental elements of a good first page are. And they will probably be things you've heard before, but there's still things that people apply very shallowly. And so I think the key ingredient is to apply these things at a depth that you're not already currently doing. So you already know about tension on the first page, but how can you take that to the next level? So if some of these things are ideas you've heard of before or that you're already trying to apply, search for in the examples and in how I'm explaining it, and just from the opportunity to concentrate on it, search for a new and deeper way to apply what it is. Because like I think the ever-present example is everyone knows that your manuscript needs to have stakes, right? But so many agents and editors talk about missing stakes in manuscripts. So it's not always a problem of people not knowing what they need to do. It's just them not doing enough of it, or them not doing it clearly enough or often enough. So yeah, take the focus time to concentrate on these things as an opportunity to pause, take a step back, reevaluate how deeply and how often and how well you're doing some of these fundamental things, if they are fundamental to you. So first I want to go over those fundamental elements. Then I want to go through, just take a quick glance at some really best-selling and classic examples of how these things were used. And then we'll take a look at the first pages of the people whose lucky names were drawn to be ripped apart, Mary and Paul style. I appreciate the laugh, thank you. So what I'm gonna do here is share my screen. And I have like 17 things open because of these files for the pages. Here we go. Okay, so first pages, I think, like the key ingredients are capturing the reader's attention. Obviously, we need to do that, but how? Through creating intrigue, and emotional involvement. And these two things are what I call the head and heart values. Essentially, you're capturing their brain and you're tugging on their heartstrings. And that's the surest way to do it. I've heard some people say this is the only way, this is the best way. I don't necessarily think it's the only way or the best way. It's just, this is the foolproof thing. This is the rule that you start out following that then you can twist or break, as I'll show you in some of these examples. But usually this is the way you capture the reader, the editor, the agent's entire self. You've got them fully involved because it's at the intellectual level and the emotional level. So yeah, this separates into head and heart. By intriguing the reader, you want to make them think or question or fear something. Notice fear is not emotional involvement. It's survival is very basic and physical, and yes, it's a gut reaction, but it's not what I mean by a heart value. That's a very physical, primal sort of thing, but heart values have to go a lot deeper than that. Make them make a decision or a judgment call. Give them a moral challenge. Give us knowledge, that insider expertise that's just super wildly compelling, or insight. Readers come to fiction to be moved, right? If you can give us that on the first page, you're golden. You've gotten our brains intrigued. The second thing you want to do on that first page is the emotional involvement. Give us a reason to deeply connect with this character, not just a shallow, they like their dog, they're nice to their mom, they want the same things we do reason, but something really deep and unique. You know, this needs to be presented in a way we haven't seen before. And oftentimes, you know, when I see writers trying to reach for that heart value or that emotional connection on page one, it is the thing that we always have seen before. It's being nice to their cat, you know, taking the save the cat a little bit too literally. It's a fairly expected conflict-driven relationship with a parent. It's, you know, a fight with someone they love, something like that. But dig for a new and deeper way to present that if that's what you're dealing with. Because you want to get us away from the expected. If we expect it, it's not going to tug on our heartstrings. One way to do this is showing us what they care about. If we see what they are passionately invested in or what they love beyond reason, then we know this is a character we can entrust our hearts with, and we'll care because they care. This gets tougher with unlikable characters, quote unquote, or stories from the perspective of an anti-hero, something like that, but we'll get into that with exceptions. This is about, you know, like the core fundamental things you want to make sure you know how to do deeply and well. The other thing is restraint. You know, we don't need a ton explained on page one. If you hook our head and our heart, we'll have a lot of patience left for waiting for the details and the explanation to catch up. What you want is to move the reader. So it's okay to just throw something wild and fascinating out there and let it sit. A lot of first pages get bogged down with a lot of exposition and a lot of backstory. You've all heard not to do that, but a lot of the times that still happens when somebody's trying to work their hook in, you know, because then maybe that's someone's the princess and this requires explaining the transcontinental dynamic or whatever. We don't need to know about that transcontinental dynamic on page one. We just need to know the head value and the heart value. These are other things, kind of cake frosting, if you will. I think they're the other ways beyond head and heart that you can grip the reader. Voice, tone and mood, subtlety. I think subtlety is a huge one. It shows that you know exactly how to play with the emotions and the attention of the character. You know how to make them think a certain thing. You know how to let them know you're playing a game with them, but not really tell them what the game is yet. You know how to make them question, but give them just enough information that they're not confused. That relationship with your own work where you're doing not just 15 things on page one, but 15 things in one line is what communicates mastery to me. That's, as soon as I see something like that in writing, I know that I'm in for a hell of a story. And confidence has obviously a unique relationship with subtlety too. that writer, or a confident writer, doesn't have to try to prove anything. They're not going to get purple prose. You're not going to get melodrama. You're just going to get a good story. That writer knows they have something amazing, and they're going to let you see for yourself. They're not afraid of their own flaws. They're not afraid of where the reader might not be engaged in the story. They have something wonderful. They know it, and they're here to show it off. These are also the areas in which you can lean on to break that head and heart value. And the reason I think that it's so key to have these values on the page, these elements on the page, I'm getting some feedback from somebody. Could you check to make sure that you're muted, just so that we don't have feedback? Awesome, thanks. The reason it's so key to have these ingredients on page 1 is that data shows us readers give a book between 3 and 5 seconds. So that's why you don't need to explain. That's why this, in my opinion, these things must be on page 1 in some ingredient amount or another, because your reader picks it up, they're skimming, they're wanting one thing, they want to be hooked. And they give you maybe 3 or 5 seconds to do that. So, the first application of this is page 1 of A Wrinkle in Time. Let me check the chat before we get into this, just in case. Okay, yep, you guys are good. Let me know if you have a question in the chat, and I can stop to address that. For example of subtlety and confidence, first line, it was a dark and stormy night. That's not normally something I recommend starting out your book with. Everyone knows it's one of those, she's breaking a rule here and she knows it. So what this line tells me is that she wants to create this mood of a classic, kind of fairy tale bedtime story book. But also it's the same kind of I am not statement that I talked about in the emotional engagement webinar. She's making a statement here that this book is going to be exactly the kind of bedtime story you expect, which makes us think, oh no, it's not. So she's doing a number of things in these lines. She's setting it up as a classic, but she's also subverting that at the same time, which I think is brilliant. And it's a lot of subtlety and a lot of confidence all in one line. But then of course we move into something very straightforward. We have Meg sitting in her bedroom. We have very evocative tone. We're getting a lot of sensory detail. We're getting a lot of imagery here, and we're getting repetition and whatnot. It's good prose, of course it is. And then we start getting into her emotions, and you can see her hooking us with that heart value, with these universal but deep and unique application of things we all feel that are going to make us care about Meg. She feels lesser than, she feels looked down on at school, and those are good things, but in my opinion, that's not deep enough. Those are just the little bookends, the finishing touches. What she does here is stands up for her brother. And that kind of deep sibling love, went back one too far. That kind of deep sibling love is core to the story. It's the whole core of the story, and she gets that on page 1. But it's also something that we can all really relate to, especially in middle grade fiction like this. Sibling relationships are a huge part of your life. And she gets physically involved for it. She'll fight for this love for her brother. So there we get that heart value, and we also get the head value. We have these questions of what happened to her dad and why her mother. Where is that? Down here. Her mother says, when your father gets back from where and when. It tells us the character doesn't know where her dad is and when he's coming back. Why is that? And we know she has a deep and complex relationship with him from the multiple emotional hints we get on this page of her missing him and yet not being angry at him. And why wouldn't a girl be angry that her dad is gone and she doesn't know where he is if it's one of those traditional situations where a parent bailed? So I think this is like a perfect classic example of nailing all of those 2 core ingredients and then those little frosting ingredients. There's voice and tone in spades here. There's a lot of subtlety, a lot of confidence. And then we can get into the next example. This is The Book Thief. wildly different and also wildly confident. Like you open it up and you're like, what is going on? But we get this works for a different perspective. You know, the book opens from the perspective of death. And so we're expecting to see something different in thought pattern, in the way that brain works. And that's what we've got. It's fragmented, it's formatted oddly, it's very kind of self-absorbed. And I'll give you guys a minute to read this a little bit in case some of you haven't read the book. So I think what's so interesting to me about this is, obviously we're from the perspective of death, but we've had Grim Reaper stories before. Only this one sets itself up to be the original, the real thing, the death story to end all death stories, right? It has that confidence, it has that scope, it has tons of subtlety and complexity to it, and there's all those little frosting ingredients scattered through it, right? Him talking about a chocolate colored sky, the idea of a sky to slowly suck on. Not only is it beautifully written, but it's an odd idea. It's just off kilter enough. There's crossing of senses out here. The sound of the smell of my footsteps. So there's all those tone and voice elements. There's tone and voice for days here in this. And however, we're not seeing yet that heart value yet. Why do we care about death? That would be a tough perspective to be in. What is it that makes us feel? Well, in the second page, it's right here, and I copied a little bit more of this one because the first page has so much white space on it. Again, confidence. And then we get right into, in the very first paragraphs of the book, why we should care. What does death care about? The leftover humans, the survivors, the ones he can't stand to look at. And then we get down to one specific survivor with this ultimately supremely confident last line: I saw the book thief 3 times. I think this is a masterful example of intriguing us with an idea, grabbing our heartstrings with something universal that has a unique and deep application to it. The idea of death caring most about the people who are left behind is new and different and unique. And that's going to make us be able to feel that idea in a new way. And it also has those frosting ingredients. So these are 2 very different, but hit the nail on the head sort of examples of what I think makes a traditional ideal first page. A third example here is from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I'm sure you guys have all seen this before, and I want to make sure we keep moving at a good clip, so I'm not going to make you guys read all of this, but you can pause it to read later in the recording if you want to go back and look at it more specifically. This one is an exception here. We don't have the main character in the perspective for page 1, and we're also almost prologuing it with moving way far before the main character's story truly starts. But you notice what she's leaning on is those intrigue values, the head things rather than the heart things. So we get a lot of questions here, like immediately. Again, she's trying that she's using that I am not technique from that I was talking about before. Mr. and Mrs. Well, where we go? Mr. and Mrs. Dursley were perfectly normal. Are they? It makes us ask a question. Of course, the answer is no, they're not perfectly normal. They're horrible people. And also they're related to magical people. But then, of course, it's also voice and it's also tone. They're the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious. They didn't hold with such nonsense. Okay, so we get a very clear perspective there. We get a really engaging voice, again, with those frosting ingredients. And I don't mean frosting in the sense that they're expendable. Absolutely not expendable. They're just I don't know, you could call them secondary ingredients in a way, although I don't think voice is by any means secondary. It's usually not something a first page can ride on. It's not the skeleton of it. So then we get into making us question, which is, again, those head values. They had a secret, their greatest fear. Somebody would discover it. They couldn't bear if anyone would find out. But then she does have a little bit of this heart value here. She primes us and pulls at our heartstrings to make us care about Harry in paragraph 2. Because we see the estrangement of the sisters, we can very clearly blame Mrs. Dursley for it because of the way she's talking. We get the sense that they're very bitter and standoffish and that that's the cause of the break. And they don't want their kid to associate with Harry. So he's already primed to be an outcast whose family doesn't want him, right, in paragraph 2. And again, this is core to the story. You see how these authors are getting the emotional dynamic and the internal journey of these characters on page 1. They're getting just a very focused thematic piece of it. And this primes us to care about Harry, even though we're not here to hear, or Harry's not here for us to hear what is important to him or what he cares about, or to see him behaving in a manner that would trigger, you know, our emotional compassion. We just see how his family views him, and that primes us to care about him later. But he's not the point right now. These questions are what happens. And she keeps saying, there's nothing, like, these people are normal. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. There's nothing about this guy to suggest, which of course makes us think something's coming, something's coming, something's coming. And then she backs it up with this owl and with the cat. And these are also, I think she's got a baby, an owl, and a cat on page 1. That's a lot of emotionally connective ingredients. People love animals. And I think one of the reasons she's doing this is to communicate tone, the whimsical nature, and just the really charming voice of the story and the world as a whole, but also because we don't have anything on this page to love yet. We don't have Harry here. What else do we get? We get a really cool cat, an interesting owl, and we get primed to care about Harry in the future. And I think just those touches are enough for emotional ingredients to make us care, because she's leaning so hard on voice and tone and intrigue. So if you're going to reduce the amount of one or the other of those ingredients in a book, amplify everything else, because they have to do more heavy lifting. So those questions has to be bigger. The intrigue has to be deeper. We have to have even more urgency and wonder about what's happening. Last example is Bridget Jones's Diary. And you can see the books that I'm kind of taking a glance at here aren't books that were on the bestseller list for a week or two or even a couple of months. These are books that have a generational following, that have been made into not just one movie, but several movies. These are books that have become influential in how we read and have inspired books themselves. And I think there's a reason for that. And some of those reasons are on page 1. And you want to talk about using I am not here to make us question, make us engage, to give us those ideas that are going to trigger our mental analysis and our emotions. Right here, I copied 2 pages because, again, there's so much white space. I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to have to share that again. Sorry, guys. No. Sooner or later, I will get this figured out. Okay, so the first page is I will not, and the next list is I will. So she's promising herself all these New Year's resolutions. And she starts out with very ordinary things: drink, smoke, waste money. But then she gets into uniquely personal and weirder stuff, but it also stays immensely relatable. And you can see these heart values, these emotionally connective elements in everything. But instead of one huge thing, she's going for lots of small things: the complex relationships with the parents, the disappointment in romances, the falling for guys who are immature, complaining about friends and being negative, obsessing about her boss. Notice she gets that there on the first page. And you can also see this really resilient personality, having the strength and the self-awareness to sit down and write up a list like this. And then in her list of I will, you can start to see kind of her insecurity and her internal journey that she's going to have to go on. All these things that are just immensely telling about her as a person bleeding through these items, as well as her desire to be a good person. The desire to be a good person is an incredibly powerful heart value. We care a lot more about people who want to be good than people who actually are good, because that's internal conflict. If somebody wants to be good, they know that they aren't, and that they have a ways to go, and that they can see it. And really, it's I think a lot of us view the desire to be good as the important thing. And so if you can work in something about that into your first page or your first chapter, especially if you're dealing with a character who has some major flaws or commits something really hugely, something that really breaks a boundary or crosses a line early in your story, give them the desire to be good, and you'll be shocked how much forgiveness readers will give that character. And so those things just come all together. Like, she does a little bit of everything in these first two lists. And she does it so well and so clearly and so uniquely that she doesn't need to give us one huge thing, because she's given us 17 little things that all come together to give us this very well-rounded person that we can empathize with, that is posing all these questions to us. Because of course the implied question is, will she or won't she? Is she going to succeed? And you can see at the bottom of the screen, an exceptionally bad start. So we know we're starting out from a point of conflict too. But it has that confidence. Like, there's a lot of nerve in having the opening 2 pages of your story be a list. Like, if there's a checklist of things not to do for the opening of your story, that's one of them, but here she's doing it. And it works because she's leaning on voice, tone, subtlety, and confidence. And through all that, still managing to engage our brains with questions, and to make us ask what's next, and to make us care about this character. Okay, so that is the end of what I think are like the core fundamentals to great first pages. Any questions? No questions? Okay, awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get into these first pages. And I have a ton of admiration for everyone who volunteered their first pages for this. Public critique is hard. When you put your pages out on a blog for public critique, you have the privacy of your own home to go, cry into your pillow or hug your dog or complain to somebody about how terrible and how someone just didn't get what you're going for, etc., and you're the undiscovered genius of the current century. Can't they see that? That's a lot harder to do in a webinar. So I really admire everybody who's willing to give up that emotional space and cry distance that you normally get when it comes to critique. And also, I feel bad for anyone who has to follow A Wrinkle in Time and Bridget Jones's Diary for first page critique. However, they say no one is a good writer. Some people are good rewriters, right? So what's on the pages isn't necessarily indicative, and that's something I try to remember when I'm editing for somebody. What you have written is not necessarily indicative of your skill and your talent as a human. Everybody has deeper that they can push themselves and deeper that they can push their story. So, and also I have no clue where you guys are in first drafting. These may be, the first 10 pages may be all that exists of these books. I didn't ask. So it will be an adventure. Okay, and no questions before we get started with that? No? Okay, so you guys are getting a really raw look at my editing process here. I skimmed these first 10 pages to figure out kind of the plot and what's going on, but I'm going to try to come up with on-the-spot insightful things to say to you humans, so we'll figure out how this goes. Let's start with Lorna Riley. Is she here? Yeah, yes, she is. All right, so this is the first page of locusts. And I'm going to close my, or I'm going to share my screen so that you guys can see this and read along with me. If I can ever get move, I need that button there. Okay, thank you. I just thanked the Zoom application. This is where we are right now. Okay. So I'll give you guys a moment to read this along with me so you can get a little more out of what I'm going to say. Okay, so that's the first 250 words. And I drew that marker there because you all probably know that a first page is longer, but what does a reader give? 3 to 5 seconds. And how are first pages formatted? This way. They're not going to turn the page to see more if you don't get them in what's here. So we're going to be looking for mental intrigue or fascination with all those questions and moral judgments or insight, as well as the emotional engagement, as well as those frosting details of voice, tone, subtlety, and confidence. And actually, I think this is a beautiful first page. The heart value, I think, is all over it. And it actually, this is really what it leans on. We get this beautiful memory of her and her dad. And it's so clear that she loves her dad and has a complex relationship with him, even though we don't really know anything about him. We don't know where they are now. She never says, I love my dad or I miss my dad, but you can just feel it in this memory because it's so personal and unique and specific and evocative. So I think that nails it. Like, that makes me care about this girl. For line edits, usually I like to take a hard look at the first line. And I want to do a session later on first line specifically because there's so much to be said about them. Really, they kind of play a game with the reader. And I think that game is underutilized in a lot of places. So I won't go into that in super detail here because I want to teach much more specifically on it later. But I think this first line does work because it starts us immediately with a very focused moment that clearly matters. And then we get some scope here. If there's a gathering of the greatest minds across the world to talk about this locust problem, that's, oh, okay, something is happening. And it's not the focus right now, but it's important. And then the next time locusts are mentioned, that's going to ping in your brain. You're going to say, oh, okay, this is a book with a real global problem to it, probably some kind of plague or disease or devastation or something. I might change this here. Her being the evening's entertainment, she's a tiny little girl, and we know she has a positive relationship with her dad, but the first time I read that, it set off like weird connotations for me, just because of how women and young girls so often are like cultural entertainment. So I might just, and I think it's weird connotations just from this phrase right here. So if I were line editing this book, I'd suggest swapping that out for something that retains that innocence and nostalgia that the rest of the memory talks about. Let's see, the next line. Okay, here, the great hall fell silent except for a growing chorus of tinkling glass. Those two things are kind of at odds. If everything else is falling silent, a growing chorus of tinkling glass kind of fights with that, I would say, except for the tinkle water glasses or something about cutlery, forks on plates, something like that. If they're doing what they're doing is eating. I think there's a table, they're in a great hall. I'm not entirely sure. But also it's not entirely relevant. I didn't realize until now that I didn't know whether they were eating or just talking or having a meeting, because the moment is so clearly focused on this emotional experience of hers. But yeah, things falling silent except for one other noise growing is a little at odds for me. And we get some really lovely tight detail here that's very specific to her. She's reciting the periodic table, which is impressive for a 4-year-old. And she's also doing it in Spanish and English. One interesting little editorial note now is that more and more imprints are asking authors to put still spoken foreign languages, not in italics. There are some resources I can post in the Slack group about this, but typically it's considered othering because it sets it apart as if the rest of the text is normal and what's in italics is different or a subset somehow. When for a lot of people are bilingual, and for example, my husband grew up speaking Spanish, and for him, he doesn't, when he's thinking, he doesn't pause to shift, oh, I'm going to start speaking Spanish now. It all kind of blends together, and he doesn't have his native language and his learned language separated in his head the way that this kind of indicates. The one exception are dead languages like Latin, typically still in italics. Some publishing houses won't insist on this, but I think there is a growing consensus that you don't need to put foreign language in italics, partially because it is kind of distracting. It is a sudden format change, and also especially in YA where we do thought speech a lot. But yeah, so you don't have to do this. And in fact, a lot of non-English speaking authors have asked that people not, especially if you're writing from the perspective of a bilingual or a multilingual character, because in their head, chances are you're not thinking English, foreign language, English, foreign language. It's much smoother and more blended. So this is kind of a tradition we have picked up from academic English, but fiction is now moving away from. Really fascinating, right? And but emotionally, I love how urgent and serious she is about this. There's a very real childhood importance about this little moment there that I think is just beautiful. The next change I would make is this here is pretty passive. I was spun in the air. I would show us that it's her dad doing it, partially because that gets us emotionally closer. And adds a little more clarity, and partially because that's probably the thing that matters to her. And it does make it a little more active. And I love this imagery with the tiny yellow bird. It's just really beautiful and exactly right, but also hard to articulate the logic behind in the way that little kid emotions so often are. So this feels really genuine to me without going over the top, and communicates that experience in a way that genuinely sounds like the way my nieces and nephews talk about things. What I would do is cut this. We know it made her feel something. And I would connect this to spinning in the air, and make it part of that sentence or connect it to that sentence, because we know it made her feel something. This does give us a little more room to process it. So that's one thing you can balance that with, is when you want a moment to be emotionally connective, give the reader the seconds to process it, either with white space or with expanding the idea a little bit to take up more space on the page. But I feel like you could do it in ways that don't necessarily tell us that she's feeling something, because we know she's feeling something. We're feeling it too. And then, of course, we're brought back to the present. What I would do, though, is I would cut this. This phrase shows up in almost every instance of a character being lost in thought and then coming back to the present. we get jarring me from my thoughts, or I jump back to reality, or someone makes an obvious comment about it, the reader is going to know what happens. You can give us the reaction, like her jumping or her head snapping to attention or her almost dropping something to show us that. But we know she's being jarred from her thoughts, and it is, since it's telling, and since we are so deep in her mind before, this actually pulls me out of the story to be told that she's being jarred. So it's one of those areas where we just don't need that much explaining. And I really like the callback to the bird moment, saying her chest is an empty cage. What I would do, though, is I would cut this line. I think the punch is in her chest being an empty cage. We'll connect it. We'll figure out why the cage is empty. We'll figure out that it's a reference to this moment she felt as a child, and she no longer has that security and happiness that made her feel, so loved as a kid, and she's really missing that now. I think the more you spell it out for us, the less impacting it is. And so if you can lean on that subtlety and that confidence like you do right here, I think it's all in that line. And then finally, here at the very bottom of the page, we get what she's doing and why. But I think that's totally fine because we've been so focused before that. We expected it to be some emotionally important moment like this where she really wanted her dad present. And yet we're having conflict with the mom here in the present day. So I think this first page is just an excellent example. And some really minor edits are going to amplify those things. The major change that I would make on this page is give us more of that mental intrigue. Give us more questions or more things to wonder. I would, from reading the rest of the 10 pages, I would say it's the dad and it's the locusts. So I would actually use some of this cut space from these extra lines and give us one more reference to locusts. And maybe you could even, you talk about a bird, maybe there's a comparison to be made with locusts. And maybe that's what you could bring her back to the present with, is a comparison to locusts somehow. There's also that comparison between the dad and the mom and the past and the present and the bird and the locust. So that sets us up with some really nice dimension and parallels, bookends to these ideas. I think you could also lean on this line really hard to give us, to make it pull maybe triple duty. If we get two references to locusts that are supposed to intrigue the reader enough to turn the page, what are those two things going to be? And how are you going to make them the most fascinating thing about, but subtle and restrained thing about the problem? So I think that's where you lean on. And maybe something else about the dad. If you feel like you can't get the locust references up to that level, then add another reference to the dad. There's a couple pages down, there's something about him dying and her not believing it was the heart attack her mom said. And that's incredibly, that's a huge reveal, and B, that's incredibly impacting. So if you can hint at that somehow, or give us some detail that there's a question about how he died on page 1, then I think you'll have like the whole package here, because there is a lot of voice. There's a lot of tension and nostalgia to the tone. There's a lot of subtlety and confidence too. All right, any questions about that? No, okay, so I'm gonna go to the next one here. And I need to, let's see here. Let's go with Nesties. This is Nesty Neems, page 1. And I'll give you guys a second to read this as well. Oh yeah, absolutely, Lorna. And to Lorna specifically, you know, I haven't read the whole rest of your book. It's something I should have said to start with. A lot of recommendations wildly depend on where the story goes. So I may be entirely off base in some of these comments. Just take what feels right to you or use it as a launch pad for your own revisions. Okay, now it's Nesty's turn. Okay, and a question from the chat. Yes, as far as I know, Locusts was YA. So for Nesty here, I think there's just some really incredibly fascinating stuff going on. And from having read the last, or the next 10 pages, it's this super fascinating situation with this girl who is being shipped off to Paris to start her own business of reselling this woman's potions. So it's the apprentice becoming, the independent in a foreign city. And there's this just really, really complex and nuanced relationship where the main character is kind of handling the master potioner a little bit, like lying to her at just the right moments, managing her emotions, telling her what she wants to hear, which is a wildly unexpected dynamic for me, and something in a situation like this. We get a lot of books that have this kind of, I don't know, the dynamic I'm getting so far is a little bit mafia or crime ring type, crime boss type relationship, but it's magic or it's potions or it's, something like that. But that dynamic is new to me. So that's a really fun twist. The fact that she has these ways that she can handle this master potioner to a point, just some of her own techniques. And that gives us a lot of intrigue about this person, this character, that she knows this person well enough to have her little slivers of influence and ways that she gets through the day without getting on this woman's bad list. And just that in general, the situation, somebody selling poisons in Paris that is fascinating to me. I want to know more about that. It's deadly. It requires expertise. There's probably lots of like subtle and complicated relationships and manipulation going on in it. Probably a lot of specifics, I hope, about the potions and how they work. That kind of mentally fascinating, like that expertise and knowledge and insight that I was talking about before. The thing that I would do is get the character acting on this page. On this page, she's almost exclusively listening to this conversation. And the conversation itself takes a couple pages to resolve and move on to the next thing. And from there, we go to a prison where a very similar sort of dynamic happens. I like that Nesty has this setup where we're kind of following this master potioner for some of her errands, doing two very different things, because then we get a sense of this character before the apprentice leaves for Paris. And I think that's key. So that's a really smart choice there. But what I would do is dig into what the main character's task is on these errands. Does she have something really specific and fascinating that she should be doing? Is it her job to kind of, I don't know, case the joint, secure it? Does she take copious notes? Is she supposed to kind of rifle through the client's belongings to see if any hints of foul play or something like that? Anything that can show her being proactive and show off some of her skill earlier on, because most of those fascinating ingredients I found later in the chapter, from page 5 on, was where she started doing this, kind of subtle manipulating, the lying to the master potioner. We started to see her expertise coming into. I would move that all up. I would give us some of that on page 1. Because the situation is fascinating, but I want to see her using that situation as a character and pushing it forward immediately in those first 3 to 5 seconds. I would also follow up with, I would maybe move this line here, what would become of the body was not our concern. There's a lot of confidence and a lot of nuance to that sentence. It's a fascinating idea. I would move it up to the beginning here and drop it right there. Specifically because those first 2 lines aren't anything, like in real life, they'd be shocking and fascinating if you were doing that, or if you saw someone do that. But in books, dead bodies abound. And people who are kind of jaded about them abound too. So we need some twist on that, if that's her dynamic. You could find probably a different way of starting that if you want to really grab us with this idea. And that could be leaning on her expertise and what she does on these errands. Like, why is she following? Surely she's supposed to be here backing up the master poisoner. Surely she is supposed to be doing something useful on these errands rather than just listening. But I think the easy fix is to drop that line right there and give it that twist, and that just sheer confidence that really drives home those bodies not being a concern to her. Yeah, these poisoners are really interesting. So I would say essentially, like, my main comment would be for Nesty to go into those last 5 pages where they're starting to talk about this manipulation and the plan for moving and all that, and sprinkle hints of that onto page 1. Like, maybe she's thinking this is her last errand. What's she gonna do when she has to go to these crime scenes in Paris? Or will she or won't she? What different boundaries is she gonna draw than this master poisoner does? So hopefully you can see some of the ways that you can take the existing situation and add more nuance, add more subtlety, add more fascinating things to it, and lean on that head value. Because this character is somebody who seems kind of emotionally distant, and is going to be hard to lean on those heart values for. So lean massively on the concept of the poisoning and the apprenticeship and her relationship with this woman and the fact that she's leaving. And I think you'll get those 3 to 5 seconds from the reader for sure. How you get the room to do that, I think, is by thinning down some of this conversation. So I think this, for example, could be cut entirely. Never one of my concoctions has failed you tells us it's not her first potion, and that she knows her by now, and that they have a long and semi-trustworthy relationship. I love the phrase bottling death, but I would save that for somewhere else, and I would cut this line too, because the fact that she's a master and disagrees and thinks this hokey folklore shouldn't apply to her is shown to us in her desire to not be compared to these backstreet quacks, and the fact that she that her prices speak for her quality. So I think that's one thing you can do to gain some room. You could probably also cut this. We know, like, you've convinced us already that she is serious about her affairs and that she's a professional in what she does. The more she talks about it, the less we believe her. It's kind of how Olympic athletes never have to tell you they're an Olympic athlete, right? You just know it from watching them perform. Or brilliant musicians, their work speaks for itself. So if she really is this caliber of a poisoner, she's not going to be telling people about it. They know, she knows they know. And then this here, I would cut as well. Partially because it's telling that she seemed embarrassed. Give us those details instead, the clues to put it together like you did with the furtive glance. There's a lot more for our brains to be fascinated by with that, because we can draw a conclusion from a furtive glance, but there's really no conclusion to be drawn from she seemed embarrassed. And we'd know why she's embarrassed as well, because she just got chastised by a major pro who has some serious clout. And then I think, for the purpose that what would become of the body line served, we were done here serves as well. So you still get a really strong ending note there for that first page. Yeah, so just to sum up, I would trim out some of these things that water it down a little to give you more room to add those mentally fascinating details, bits of expertise, and some forward motion to that character so that we see her doing something. Because right now, everything that's fascinating belongs to everybody else, except for the apprenticeship, which we want to see her using. Okay, so those are my basic thoughts on this first page. And again, I don't know where it goes from here. Like tone and story scope can change a lot of how to apply some of those things. All right, thank you for sharing your work, Nesty. I'm actually really fascinated to see where that book goes. All right. let's do Sherry. And I'm not sure if Sherry's here or not, but I will, she'll be able to view it in the recording. If not, there's my share button. Okay. Oh, okay, you are here, awesome. Or was that someone else talking to me?
No, that was me.
Okay, awesome, yep. So this is Sherry Ritz's first page. And usually one of the things that majorly affects how you apply this stuff is genre, obviously, right? Sherry, can you tell me, is this adult romance or is it women's fiction? You might be muted because I didn't catch that. I think it's romance. So I'll give you guys a second to read that as well.
It is. It's adult romance.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay, so what I would say about Sherry's pages here is that we absolutely start in the middle of things, which is great. You know, we're not sitting around waiting for the action to start happening, and there's a lot of tension. Like, this is focused on personal relationships, so I assume, and that's actually what made me guess that it was adult romance, is that emphasis on personal relationships and the mention of the ex-fiance on page 1, which is great. Those are great genre clues. But how genre applies these ingredients that I was discussing earlier, usually adult romance is very, very focused. They dig into that relationship, and that's the heart of the experience. So usually you do want voice, but the voice isn't going to be as I'm trying to think of the right words here. It's not going to be something that's kind of a character in its own way, the way that fantasy voice or horror voice often is, because it is giving up some of that room to gain a lot of depth and emotional pull out of this romance. So while being no less complex, adult romance is often very easy to identify what it's doing. It's very straightforward in its ingredients. That said, it usually has a lot of depth, because depth is what makes us feel, right? And I love that, like, here in even sentence 1, we're getting the fact that she grew up in and loved Las Vegas. But I would love to see more of that. Like, what does Las Vegas mean to her? What memories, what streets, what evocative feeling, if it has like, what's the smell of Las Vegas? What's the emotional pull it has over her? If we're going to see emotional involvement for her, she's pretty angry in page 1, and that is tough to make us connect with an angry character. So I would say lean on this love of Las Vegas to give us this little connection to her, make us think of how we love our hometowns or the cities we grew up in, and give us that little spike of connection to her, since it's not like you can dig into, you know, like Lorna did, a nostalgic childhood memory at this point. It would be wildly out of place. So we have a lot of tension. We're starting in the middle of the action. Something devastating has just happened to her. And page 1 doesn't, let's see, I don't think it says it specifically. but she's just been asked to, quote unquote, take a vacation from work, which I think means everything to her. And if so, I would get that on page 1. Because she clearly loves it. She's clearly invested in it. And I love seeing women invested in their work and being good at it. So I would, I would give us maybe one snarky, angry line about Timothy. But ultimately what should really matter, I think, on page 1 is this job and what she loves about it and why, and the fact that she's good at it. So if you can move that from the pages below up to page 1, I think you'll have really compelling ingredients there. And then I would put her anger at Timothy later on page 2. And let us gain that that immediate connection to who she is as a person and why this is devastating for her. Right now, it's tough for me to feel the anger that she's feeling because I haven't yet connected to her emotions behind it. I talked about 3rd level emotions in the webinar. Here's a great place to apply that. Like she's angry, but below that she's what? We get a hint of it here, actually a great hint of it, where she's wondering why her dad isn't standing up for her. And I would dig into that a little bit. Not a ton, not a paragraph of it, just like some word choice to let us know that this is an ultimate betrayal for her. And then, of course, Timothy is properly deserving of her wrath. This guy seems horrible in every sense of the word. And we get good physical action. These characters aren't just talking heads, which is great. The metronome image didn't quite work for me because metronomes are so consistent, and the way a tie would swing is like maybe back and forth once or twice, but then it would slow down and then barely be moving. So I was imagining it far too literally. Which kind of took me out of the story because I was imagining the tie ticking back and forth very consistently, measuring time, which is a little more Alice in Wonderland than I think the moment was going for. And then we get to hear about her fiance, but there's a lot of dialogue on this page, and I would maybe condense that down or thin it down a little bit to make room in these first 250 words for defining at least the surface of the problem, that she has to leave work and that she loves work, and why she loves it and why this is a betrayal from her dad. If we can get the betrayal from her dad, how much she loves her work and why, and the fact that she's being forced to leave onto page 1, I think that is your head and your heart values right there, making us think and question and making a moral decision along with her, as well as feeling this betrayal and this loss of something that she loves, and probably the associated shame and regret or second guessing or floundering that's going to accompany that, those 3rd level emotions beneath this anger. If you can tap into that on page 1, I think this will like absolutely like leap to life, and those readers are going to give you the 3 to 5 seconds that they need in order to turn the page, or that you need in order to get them to turn the page, because you will have grabbed them at both of those intellectual and emotional levels. Okay. So any questions about anything that I just said? Yeah, I'm looking at the chat here. Absolutely. I'm totally rooting for Penny too. And there's some really great imagery here, and she makes particularly good use of her consonants too. It reads really smoothly. This is somebody, it reads like somebody who's used to paying attention to the sound of her words, which is super important to making what is fiction that doesn't usually rely on a lot of metaphor and imagery, and has that super sharp focus on relationship. You can still get just like really beautiful and evocative and meaningful language out of paying attention to that sound with the syllables and repetition and some poetic devices. Let's see. Okay, somebody's asking about, someone mentioned once that the love interest should be introduced in the first chapter of romances. How do I feel about that? I'll stop sharing here for a second since I have to do that anyway. I think typically that's expected because that is the story. So that is the inciting incident, right? You know, that's the first definite motion of the plot is meeting the love interest. I think a lot depends on how you have your chapters divided up, how long is it, and how much external plot, like what's the external conflict. So I think there is some wiggle room there. The standard reader expectation, I think, is that the meeting is in chapter 1 or at the point of view flip at the latest. So if you're going to upend that, then make it clear why. I think maybe your external conflict is stronger. Maybe they've already met and they haven't had the moment that, like, maybe they've been friends for a long time, and so they haven't had that moment of recognition where the reader realizes, oh, this is the hero or heroine, you know, the love interest. So I don't think it's a hard and fast rule. I think if you're going to upend it, know why and have a good reason and solve for any disadvantages of it. But make sense? Awesome. Okay. But yes, thank you to Sherry for sharing your work and giving everybody else the chance to love it and learn from it. And if any of you, as I'm critiquing, have further questions about whatever I'm saying, feel free to email or message me on Slack about it later too. Okay, we have 2 left. Let's go with A.C. Nixon. So, gosh, my icons are moving around everywhere. I think I'm mousing over the wrong thing. Okay. And I'll give you guys just a second to read this too. And this is adult. Okay, so I think there's a lot to love about this first page. I love the way she talks about her dad. Like, I'll highlight it here for you. The comparison to the desk is really fascinating. I think not many of us would dare compare our parents to a piece of furniture, but she gets away with it here. And also, you know, rather than talking about hair color and eye color and all these other sorts of driver's license details, instead we're talking about the feeling that her dad evokes in her and their relationship. And I think that just really comes alive here, especially the line, dark wood, darker secrets. That juxtaposition, that contrast of object and idea, of tangible and abstract, works really well. And then we also get emotional journey here, a change in her feelings about the room, which tells us so much about the situation in them as people. And in fact, the material about her dad, let's see, where she's talking about until recently, she saw him for who he was rather than who I wished him to be. That's really compelling. I would say so far that's the heart value on this page, rather than her being told she can't marry Eduardo. I would dig into, I think, this takes a little thinking, but I kind of think Eduardo is, the issue with him is fighting with the issue with her dad. Like, I have so many questions about who Eduardo is, why she won't let him marry him, or why her dad won't let him marry him. And then later, you know, we come on to find out a whole lot more about him, and that Eduardo has been cheating, but that's not why her dad doesn't want him to get married to his daughter. It's something else, and he's essentially like manipulating her because he found out about the affair, and he's telling her she has to dump him or else, and it gets pretty complicated, and I had to read it a couple times to figure out which threads impacted which threads. So I think for me, this opening situation is a little too complex, because what I really want to know about is the moment she found out her dad was a criminal. And at first I thought this was the moment she was finding that out. So I had some trouble reconciling whether this moment was about marrying Eduardo or whether this moment was about finding out her dad was a criminal. And I think for page 1 at least, let that shine, dig into that. That's really fascinating, and she clearly feels it deeply, and apparently even more deeply than she feels for Eduardo, because this whole first page is about her dad. So I would reframe this to have this be her dealing with discovering her dad is a criminal, and the emotions wrapped up in that, or at least confronting him about it for the first time, which you could still make it the moment that she's being told she can't marry Eduardo, but maybe that comes up as a result of the conversation, and that happens on page 2. Like, I would, instead of having the first page's focus be split like this between I want to marry him, no you can't, and my dad is a criminal and I don't know how to deal with that, I would let page 1 be about my dad's a criminal and I don't know how to deal with that, and then let the situation open up a little more, especially because on page 2 we get another character involved, and then her mom is involved, and then Eduardo himself comes in, and it feels to me like it expands too rapidly. I was having trouble keeping track of the dynamics that were at play. So I think a tighter focus will really help amplify what's going on here. However, that said, it does make me care, and there's a lot to think about on this page, and it particularly down here, the writing gets very nuanced with a lot of subtlety and a lot of complexity and a lot of emotional resonance, as well as just some really beautiful prose, which of course create those other things. Any questions about anything else I just said? Okay, awesome. So yeah, I think this is an issue of all the right ingredients are there. They're just fighting with each other a little bit. So I would focus it more to give you more room on page 1 in those first 3 to 5 seconds. So we ask fewer questions that are going to distract us, fewer plot questions, really. And I very rarely say, give me less plot, but here I would give a little less plot to let us tap into that initial dynamic, and then let it slowly, like unravel, unfold, kind of onion-like. Awesome. Okay. And I think some of these things, a 10% difference is going to make a 90% improvement. It's those, if you guys have ever, I don't know, I always go back to baking examples, but if you guys have ever frosted a cake, the stage before you put the piping on, before you pipe on the frosting, it looks like a mess. It looks like you dropped it. And one thing I always say in revising is that the final 10% is 90% of the magic. So I think even if you guys make some small adjustments because of these comments, or use them as a launch pad to other adjustments, you'll see that a lot of them make a huge difference, even though what you're just changing out a couple lines or adjusting here and there, because it gives room and depth to other things. And the difference between connecting and not connecting can simply be one line, but the effect on the reader is 10 times. All right. And that was AC Nixon's. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Steve Yoon. Any questions before I start his? Nope? Okay, awesome. I will dig in here. Okay. All right, and I'll give you guys a second. The One Wish by Steve Yoon. Okay, I absolutely love this. I almost spit out my water a couple times. The voice, like Alexis and Ashley said, and Delara, and yeah, everybody. It's hilarious, and it's really confident too. You guys, I'm hoping you can see, like, this is a great example of that confidence that I'm talking about, and that real connection with the character's mind, like being completely unafraid to put them, or maybe being very afraid but doing it anyway, to just put them fully on the page. And yeah, absolutely, like Alexis just pointed out, that I am not. The character makes a statement, we question it. The character says something is not true, we wonder if it is. So it's a very clear prompt for us to agree or disagree, to make that moral judgment, to pose that question, to decide if we agree, and that is engagement. People must answer questions. It is in our nature. So I'm going to scroll back up to the start here. I love the first line. For starters, I knew that I wasn't the long-lost heir to some forgotten throne. Makes me wonder, was there a question about that? Like, what in the world is happening here? I love that. Nor was I the chosen one. Okay, well, yeah, that grounds it. We know it's not me, which is fascinating and refreshing in fantasy. I think the market is ready for some very normal people in fantasy worlds, or at least, you know, the non-chosen ones, the people who got picked last on Dodgeball. And then there's a real awareness too, kind of a meta awareness of the own genre, with, I'm not the type of one that's going to join a band of adventurers and go on an epic quest. And the reason is because he's not very outdoorsy, which I can identify with. I think, again, that's really refreshing to see in fantasy, and it sets up this promise to the reader that this fantasy is going to be new and unexpected. It's not insulting what came before it. It's not talking down about its own genre, but it's saying, hey, look, this is new and different. And that's an amazing promise to the reader to make on page 1. That said, they'll get you if it's not. So Steve, make sure that promise pays off. Readers will be looking for it, and that's, if this first page hooks them, that's going to be part of why. About here, let's see here, is where I feel it starts getting kind of tangenty. Partially because I think the punch from not being a very outdoorsy type of person, that line right there, this line, has all the rest of this packed up in it. And for seconds, I think this kind of material could be included later, where we have a little more room for the character rambling some rambly voices, which are totally allowable and fine, still have to be reined in a lot at the first page, because you still have that same 3 to 5 seconds to hook them. And you've absolutely hooked my brain, but I'm still waiting for my emotions to get hooked. So I would actually cut this and maybe move it to a different point in the manuscript, put it into an empty file of scraps you want to figure out where to use later. But I would give us that. This is a huge chunk of page 1. It's almost half of it. And it's really just spelling out and reinforcing stuff that we've been told earlier. So, and you noticed several people commented immediately towards the end, it really gets going, him wanting to create this noteworthy spell. And that's why I included a little bit more than 250 words here, is because I wanted you guys to see what came after this tangent, is that he really wants to create this noteworthy spell, something with his name attached to it. And it's such a very real teenage voice here, or at least young person voice, that it maintains that realism. Even though we're talking about spells, it maintains the realism of not being the type of wizard to go on an outdoorsy quest, while still amplifying the genre elements. So we're getting that magic in there that fantasy readers come for, but it's still grounded in this, this kid could live next door to me kind of voice. And then also, this is the heart value. He wants to do something great. And there's some complicated emotions about his parents involved there, but he loves this. And the fact that he loves magic and wants passionately to do something makes me feel like I can connect with that soul. Somebody who wants something deeply enough to go against the grain for it, this is a really unique and personal application of that universal desire. So that this is where I get my emotions involved. So what I would do is just cut that and have this be page 1. And I think at the end of this page, when the reader has to make the choice, do I put it down or do I turn the page? They're going to turn the page, because you captured their imagination and their heart, their brain and their emotions, and you did it in a way that subverts genre expectations whilst not insulting the genre as a whole. And it also has a voice and tone in spades, and it makes this really huge promise to the reader that this is going to be unique and different, and this is going to be a person that's worthy of following on this unique and different journey. That, what I would say, is an epic epic first page. Any questions about this? I'll stop sharing here. Thank you for sending your work in, Steve, too. Super exciting to get to see such wide-ranging talent in this group. There's a real mix of genres and voices in here. Okay, well, we ran a little bit over time like I expected, but I felt like it would be much more useful for you guys to see some of the first pages that did what I was talking about before I started giving notes, so that you have that to compare for concrete examples and whatnot. Did you guys like this? Was this helpful? Is this a format you guys would like to see me, a deliverable, to be very technical about it, you guys would like me to keep offering? Yes, like you're going to tell me no, but still, I like seeing the yes. It's good for my ego. Oh, that's a good suggestion, Zach, sending out the reading pages in advance. But I also don't want to assign people homework either. But yeah, if there was a way to get around having to pause for everybody to read, that might be more helpful too. And people don't have to read them if they don't want to. What would you guys think of having the pages or queries sent out in advance? Good for some people, not great for others. Okay, some people liked seeing them here first. Yeah, that's actually why I didn't want to like redline them first to start with, is because I want you guys to see my brain going through it, even if I say you know or so 17 million times while doing it. Okay. So people seem split on it, but no one's yelling. Okay, awesome. Any questions about first pages, or things, questions about exceptions, or something you're wondering about in your own? Opening pages of Practical Magic. I'm wondering about them too. I've never read it. Yeah, if it did, when books do everything a book is not supposed to but still hooked you, look for how it involved your emotions, because they may be doing that exactly what I've been talking about in a brand new application of it. Because if they hooked you, that means they made you care. If they made you care, that means they triggered your emotional involvement, and that's the whole goal. So look for how they're triggering emotional involvement. And I would say, even while you're still thinking about this, use this knowledge. If you use it, you'll retain it, right? That's why teachers remember grammar and no one else does. That is why. So maybe like pull out the 5 books you feel most strongly about. If you don't own them, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and look at the look inside feature and look through what they're doing and try to figure out why. How are they making you care? What's the hook? How are they abandoning the head value and the heart value entirely, and leaning on voice? The Fault in Our Stars does that. When I was looking for examples, The Fault in Our Stars leans entirely on voice for page 1. And I'm kind of surprised he got away with it. I think he's surprised too. And let's see, what else did I look at? I looked at the first page of Sex and the City, which is a novel, by the way. I've been watching some episodes of the show, and so I picked up the novel at a thrift store and opened it up, and that deals almost entirely with intellect. There's very little to trigger your emotions. It's pretty jaded. It's really factual. It's entirely upper level, purely mental fascination. She's talking about the death of love in Manhattan, very objectively. It's wildly fascinating. And I think that's on purpose, because people are expecting a book entirely about relationships to be really warm and fuzzy, and she's subverting expectations that way by saying, nah, we're going to be really cold and callous. I also looked at the opening of Big Little Lies, phenomenon right now, you know, right? Huge, weighty psychological suspense / women's fiction-ish. The entire first chapter is a bystander slowly figuring out what's happening at the elementary school across the street. We don't really know anything about this woman. It's her and her cat. The cat has almost a perspective. It's omniscient. So like you get this cat's emotions and what they're thinking. It's wild. Like it's weird. Like go look it up on Amazon. Absolute rule breaker. But it slowly builds this like horror of what could be happening at this little kid's school right across the street with these perfectly normal people. And it's just the unfolding of this tiny little mystery that rockets off the entire rest of the book. It's not even from the point of view of the first characters, but it hooks you so strongly and asks such a big question in so many different ways, so thoroughly, that you can't put it down. So those are some exceptions where, you know, just to reinforce that point earlier, when you're not leaning on head and heart, lean on the other ingredients that much more strongly. If you're going to have a first page, if you're going to write The Fault in Our Stars, A, don't set out to write The Fault in Our Stars, but B, if it's going to rely entirely on voice, that better be the sharpest, most complex and relatable voice that we never expected. And if you're going to lean on, like Big Little Lies, if you're going to lean on mystery only or intrigue, like mental fascination only, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo does this. It's just two guys trading a story about a flower that arrives the same time of the year every year. That's all it is. That's the opening of a global phenomenon. Is this one guy calling another guy to say the flower's here again? And it works because they're leaning on this weird question of why does this matter? And that's a big story promise, that I'm going to make you care for 400 pages about this mysterious ritual that happens in your mail every year. So those are some ways that you can break those rules. But watch how many rules you're breaking. And if you're going to break them with confidence, solve for the pitfalls, but obviously. But if you already feel like your concept is a risk, lean into it, or do the thing that's guaranteed to work and aim for the head and the heart with tons of voice and some cool, little fascinating tone elements and those white space confidence elements and big bold statements, those kinds of things. So that's two different ways you can handle that. Lean way into the risk. If you're writing from Death's point of view, chop up the first page, bold sections of it, talk about tasting colors and sucking on the sky, or, I know, right? Or go the Wrinkle in Time path and have this just very thorough, every ingredient clearly on the page and in sharp focus. Yeah, epic first lines. Do they just kill me? I have a list of my favorite first lines of books. That's how nerdy this gets. Okay, I don't want to keep you all more than 2 hours past when we were supposed to end, haha. But any other questions about this? About first pages? Oh yeah, I love Warm Bodies. The book made me cry. Tough to connect with an angry character. Characters who are really bitter and jaded. People do not like reading about somebody who is kind of small-minded and selfish. That, we want to put it down. I feel like we deal with that so much in everyday life. You just cannot get your mom off your back. Something like that. We have a hard time reading about that on page 1 or in the first 5 pages. Also, really self-absorbed characters. That can be, if you lean on voice there, it can be really funny, but go for humor with really unlikable characters, because humor is likable, right? And if the voice itself is funny, but the character is terrible, will stick around longer. A perfect example is Gone Girl. Nick at the beginning, right? The whole question is, did he kill his wife? His wife disappeared. Did he do it? In no way does she want to make us like that character. That would be undoing the whole premise of the book. So the heart value on page 1 in Gone Girl, there isn't one. It's all mental fascination. He's talking about his wife's skull and how he likes the shape of her head and how he wants to sit down and unravel what's inside her brain. And the central question of their marriage is, what are you thinking, Amy? And it's really haunting and nuanced and weird. And he's a supremely unlikable, small-minded, selfish character. So if you want to look at that, open up Gone Girl, even on Barnes & Noble Look Inside feature. Look what she does with him. She leans hard on the mental fascination. She leans hard on voice and setting. And she leans hard on her own subtlety and confidence. If you know the twist in that book, the first line should shock you. If you've read that book, go back and read chapter 1. She's playing a game with you. She knows it. She knows you're not going to know it until you reread it. The point of Gone Girl is to reread, I think. Because, yeah, there's that much there to take away that's working at you subconsciously. But anyway, yeah, unlikable characters or angry character introductions. Gillian Flynn is a master of them. Sharp objects in dark places are 2 of the least likable characters I have ever seen in my life. Boy, do those characters have to work for their growth moments, but they get them. It's the Michael Scott effect. right? Like any of the Office fans, how do we end up liking Michael Scott? Well, first we have other people to like, and then we slowly see inside his incredibly desperate need to be loved, and then we see some reasons why, and then he does something just horrible and absurd and small-minded and selfish and self-absorbed that keeps us from getting too soft towards him. And by the end of his character growth, we've walked him in, the writers have walked him into a much more relatable, normal human, likable place, but it takes him a good 5 seasons. So look at Gone Girl, look at The Office, look at Arrested Development for unlikable characters. Leaning hard on the humor, leaning hard on those relatable family dynamics. The sister you just cannot get along with, the parent-child relationship, the mom who's just not even on this planet, like sometimes you feel that about your parents. And so it takes that very relatable dynamic and magnifies it, right, for comedic effect and for, to see it more clearly. But I think sometimes we take unlikable characters very, very seriously, and they don't all have to be. And The Office and Arrested Development are prime examples of that, and has how to use humor to offset them and wide casts to offset them. Anything else? That was a great question, by the way, about connecting with angry characters. I still hate Michael Scott too, especially in season 1. He's the worst. I almost can't get through season 1. Okay, well, I will let you guys go then. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to post them in Slack. Don't forget to be using threads when you're in Slack so that people don't get tons and tons of notifications, or to mute or leave channels you're not interested in. And don't forget to check your direct messages too. For those of you who haven't used it all that much, below all the threads, you can have it like a direct message, just like on Twitter. But it will light up. You should get a notification if you have it. But the next item is the artistic vision development chat for next week. So we'll all just be getting together on a chat. You don't have to use your webcam. You can wear your pajamas and come unshowered and all that. But I'm going to be posting a TED Talk that's only, I think, 17 minutes long from Brené Brown on vulnerability. And it's so good. And I feel like vision as an artist has to start with vulnerability, with yourself, with the reader, and with the character, and your character's vulnerability with the reader. And so I want you guys to listen to that. It's on YouTube. It's free. Everybody should be able to access it. And it's kind of like therapy too. So I think we'll benefit in multiple ways. But then we'll all just get together the last week of the month to chat about that. So you can watch it whenever you want, but then we'll all get together at the specific time to talk about it. All right. Anything else before I close it all and kick you all out? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming and participating in the discussion and having your work read and being brave and beautiful souls who create wonderful things. I think it's just, you guys are the coolest, and I'm really glad that you guys are all coming together and participating with me in this. Have a wonderful night, afternoon, and morning. Talk to you all later. Bye.